Welcome to Cactus Flower. Today we're going to be talking about orchid plants, one of my favorite plants in the world. Today we have Phalaenopsis orchid plants here to show you, but the information that I'll be giving you will work with most orchid plants that you might receive. Orchid plants are really interesting because they can live 100 years or more. There are some orchids in England that are over 200 years old. These orchids that you see here are approximately 4 to 7 years old. The Phalaenopsis take 4 to 7 years for their first blooms to come out. So when you receive a plant, it really is a neat thing to have. First of all, I'd like to talk about watering of the orchids, which is probably the most common thing that people have questions about. When your orchid plants, when the roots are all green like they are here, that means the orchid plant is healthy and it's got plenty of water. I can show you an example of the roots that are kind of out from the bark, have turned a little bit of a silvery color. And when all of the roots turn silvery, that's when you know your orchid needs water. And I found the best way to water your orchids is to set them in a sink and kind of spray them down really well with the sprayer until all the bark is really good and wet. But you will want to make sure that they drain out all the way before you set it back in your pot. They can be watered in the pot. You can just spray them down real good and then just dump out any excess water. It's really important that the orchids don't sit in any water. If they sit in too much water, like any other plant, they will drown. The orchids, the roots, need to breathe. So that's about watering. Next, I like to talk about fertilizing your orchids. I generally fertilize my orchids about once a month. I use a general kind of orchid food and I dilute it down a little bit. They tell you to use more than you need. So, water them about once a week, feed them about once a month, and they're going to be really happy for you. Next, I'd like to talk about the lighting situation. Phalaenopsis specifically can take a medium to a lower light situation. An east or south facing window is really best. If you can read in the room, it's probably a good room for orchids. I don't like to have any direct sun on the leaves because that will tend to burn them, but as long as they're in a nice sunny room, you're good to go. Next thing let's talk about is repotting your orchids. Orchids do like to be kept in fairly close quarters. So if you do repot your orchid, be sure and choose a pot that's only maybe a couple inches larger than your orchids. I really like to pot the orchids in an orchid bark because that gives the roots lots and lots of air circulation. When orchids are growing in the wild, they actually attach themselves to tree bark and the roots are just growing right out there in the air and they're really, really happy. You can use a mixture of orchid bark, a little bit of perlite, sometimes moss is used, but I really think the orchid bark is really the best situation. Just be sure that when you do choose a bark, never to choose cedar. The oils in the cedar can actually kill your orchid, so stay away from that. Next, I would like to talk about when you receive an orchid, sometimes it has this real pretty green moss around the edges, and if you remove the moss when you water and when you go to put it back on, don't cover up the roots. Just kind of put it around the edge of the pot because the roots need to be in the air, they need to breathe. So I hope you enjoy your orchids. I hope this has been informative for you. And come on into our shop and see the orchids that we have on display. They're really quite beautiful. Thank you. I am often asked about orchids reblooming. Orchids, when you receive them, will bloom for several weeks. And as the blooms kind of fade away, the lower blooms will fade away. You can go ahead and just snip those off. And then the upper buds should all open nicely for you. Once the orchid is done blooming, you can go ahead and cut the bloom stalk back, close to the bottom. You can leave an inch or two of the stem. And then just keep feeding it once a month and watering it about once a week. Orchids generally rebloom about once a year, at least the Phalaenopsis do. Sometimes you'll get a random smaller bloom stalk at about 6 months, but I generally find that mine bloom about once a year. And they bloom for me here in our climate every spring. Once the cold of the winter starts to taper off, my orchids all come into bloom again, which I find very interesting because I have often bought them in bloom at all different times of the year, but they generally bloom for me all at the same time and generally in the spring after the weather turns from cool to warm.